Go.
Great. Hello, everybody. My name is Jeannine McManus. I'm here to speak to you about the parallels and paradoxes in the conservation world in South Africa and Sri Lanka. My background is actually that of just a conservation biologist. I've got about 2 decades of experience in carnivore conservation, restoration ecology, and I really enjoy environmental science research. I currently manage Vogelgat Nature Reserve. I'm also associated with the Landmark Foundation, and I'm a research affiliate at the University of the Western Cape. I got invited to Sri Lanka through the Wildlife Protection Society of Sri Lanka last year to share ideas on conservation initiatives. And as much as I went there to share the South African conservation story, I actually found it quite important to share the Sri Lankan conservation story to us. So this is what the talk will be about. And I'll start first with a slightly slow computer, which will, I'm sure, kick into gear now. There we go. I heard somebody ask, where is Sri Lanka? And I think we all know where we stand on the global map, which is sort of in the middle south here. Sri Lanka is in the middle of the Indian Ocean, off the mainland of India, and it's a small sort of arrow-shaped country, a hugely biodiversity significant spot. And of course, we know them with cricket, I think, is the main thing. What does this have to do with conservation? I'd argue absolutely everything. The clothes we wear, the food we eat, the wine we drink, the whiskey, the beer, everything has a very direct connection back to conservation. And of course, Sri Lanka's previous name was Ceylon with the colonial years, which is where all the delicious world-class teas come from. And in that context, teas also have a profound effect on conservation. And the reason I say that is because it was about 200 years ago when the world population was only at 1 billion people. It's not actually that long ago. It took about 120 odd years to double that. And then the time it took for an additional billion to be added to that shortened and shortened to current day, more or less. We were sitting at about 8 billion people. And in the next 25 years, it'll be another 2 billion. And the real scary bit is at the end of the century, what will the population density be? The predictions are very, very high. And what's more interesting, Sri Lanka, for example, okay, it's a small island that makes up about 63,000 square kilometers, high density of around 370 people per square kilometer. So it's a dense little island. But they've already hit their climax point in the population growth, which is now stopped growing and is stabilizing. And they're predicting it'll be a maximum, they'll probably reach their capacity in the next 10 years at about 30 million people, at which point they don't estimate much more growth. So their population is an older population compared to South Africa and certainly Africa in general. Currently, we're at about 62 million people, and we're sparsely separated. We've got a lot of room to ourselves. We're only at about 45 people per square kilometer. So that just gives you some context between the two countries' layout. But of course, the prediction of we've got a much younger population, a lot of high fertility, and quite a low education rate. And so all of these factors contribute towards the prediction of a very, very high population density growth comparatively to elsewhere in the world. Why does that matter? It matters because as we consume and wear clothes and drink beer, we outcompete wildlife from spaces. And there is a global current crisis where the amount of extinctions of wildlife is skyrocketing as the human population growth continues. So if nothing changes and business as usual continues, we're staring down a pretty dismal view. And I just want to go a little bit into history, and you guys can probably correct me on some things here. So I'm just going to go to a history recap for us. And from the South African context and Sri Lankan context, I was quite taken aback that it was carbon copy of one another until fairly recently. So our early days are quite similar. By the late 1400s, the Portuguese had come to South Africa. not so much to make a mark, but they were en route to India for the spices. Of course, the very lucrative spice trade was starting out, and going between Europe and India required a stopover. And that was really where the Dutch East India Company arrived, and they were a resupply station that expanded into a colony, sort of coming into conflict with indigenous Khoisan communities, but an establishment of an economy here on its own right. Of course, the British, who were also fighting for the spice trade, were stopping here by the early 1800s, and they took control over the Cape Colony. And by 1834, formal slavery came to an end, but there was a lot of sort of civil unrest, and Dutch-speaking settlers started moving north, where there was more and more conflict brewing in the South African context. Things really changed in South Africa when they found diamonds and gold in the late 1800s. That piqued a lot more colonial interest, and a lot more fighting resumed for a long time, right up until about 1910, when it was more formally the Union of South Africa back then. So colonialism certainly disrupted a lot of indigenous land use practices in the conservation context, and profoundly influenced the narrative moving forward. We had a very extractive relationship with the land. Not much different to Sri Lanka, actually. I mean, everybody that had stopped here was actually en route to India and Sri Lanka. But the Portuguese, they really established themselves early on, because they were wanting to stay, and so they brought Catholicism, construction, and they really were driving the lucrative spice trade at that time. The Dutch wanted in, and so they actually outcompeted the Portuguese by the mid-1600s. And they implemented Roman Dutch law, which actually remains the basis for Sri Lankan law and our law, still to this day in many aspects. The early 1800s, the British basically gained control, ousting the last sort of Sinhalese stronghold. And there was massive transformation, but it became quite an important British colonial post. But the difference between the two countries is that Sri Lanka gained independence as early as 1948, basically kicking out the colonial founders in that sense. And so they started adopting quite early on their own strategies and ideals and religions. And so they've got quite a set culture of their own. So some of the similarities in the conservation context was that we both come from a very highly colonial, extractive, utilitarian aspect with nature, with quite vast scale destruction of wildlife and land. Obviously, and I'll get into this a little bit, but tea and rubber were quite an important part coming from Sri Lanka going out. And so there was massive deforestation. And in the South African context, we don't have to look terribly far to see the transformation of habitat locally as well. But there were the establishment of national parks between the two countries at about the same time. Hello. And Kruger was our first national park in in 1926, but it took a fortified conservation model. This is actually where the game's got to breed so that we can come and hunt later, because we're running out of wild places to hunt. And so that was the founding consideration for parks back then. But it was a fortified approach to basically exclude humans and so on. Whereas Sri Lanka had quite a different approach. But just to give you this brief history of conservation in South Africa, most free-roaming large carnivores have been absent from our landscapes for over 200 years. The last Cape lion was shot out in 1858. We're not exactly tolerant of wildlife around us. They were often outcompeting our livestock. And so we started eradicating quite vast numbers of mammals, and herbivores were hunted out. Not just hunting, the domestic stock that we brought with them diseases like rinderpest, and there was also massive wipeouts in that regard. By the late 1800s, we had created permanent water points in the landscape. So windmills and boreholes were set up, and that meant that we didn't need to be nomadic farming anymore. So that really started the footprint of a commercial livestock farm that we understand today, which is basically fenced off, cleared of most wildlife so you can focus on livestock production. And by the early 1900s, the historical migrations of about 1 million ungulates a year that would have come around each year were wiped out, and that had come to a halt. So we really developed a world of quite unsustainable farming practices that threatened both production and biodiversity. And there's a lot to be desired in looking forward in our conservation model, and it explains why we've got such a biodiversity crisis. The Sri Lankan context isn't much different. And the British colonial powers did, of course, put into law forest ordinances to try and curb the massive destruction, as they recognized the destruction quite early on. By the early 1900s, there was preservation laws put into place. The differences between national parks, for example, between us and Sri Lanka is very much, ours is quite a fortified exclusionary area, whereas in Sri Lanka, it's not fenced off like we do. In fact, most places that you go to, even to our SADC neighbors, you go to Wangi National Park, for example, there's no fortified fence stopping the lions and elephants from going out. They just tend to stay in. But it's a very ecologically connected system, where South Africa has got a strict, hard boundary where the animals can't actually come in and out. There's also an interesting cultural and religious value to the wildlife in Sri Lanka. Leopards and elephants play a very important role in their cultures and Buddhism. And so there's some of those differences now are becoming quite prevalent between the two countries. They're both biodiversity hotspots. One of our biggest production areas, land use wise or scale wise, is livestock and crops. In Sri Lanka, it's tea production, and that photograph in the background is the deforestation for tea plantations. Both areas could host important biodiversity, but they have low biodiversity on these production lands. South Africa only protects less than about 10% of its land formally. Okay, that's quite small. And almost 30% is formally protected in Sri Lanka. So a lot of habitat exists outside of protected areas, which is why it's not a very effective conservation tool, is having a fortified island of a protected area in patches that are unconnected ecologically. And so that's really the big difference, and where South Africa certainly has a lot to be desired. Threats to wildlife, and this is quite a healthy sort of trophic, ecological trophic scale. You've got apex carnivores at lower density than what their prey might be below them. And obviously the grasses and the plants are doing their thing within that system, and it's regulating itself. But what's happened is habitat loss and transformation. We've lost a lot of space for wildlife, and we recognize this photo, I take it. This is the Overberg. So it's not very biodiversity rich, okay. This is highly transformed landscapes of the tea production in Sri Lanka. And what's happened is now you've got islands of small pockets of habitat that host wildlife populations that are becoming less and less viable. They're becoming more isolated from one another for prolonged periods of time, inbreeding depressions. It's really just not looking good unless we can start connecting them across these vast oceans of human-dominated landscapes. Other compounding efforts, and this is in Sri Lanka, we were driving through, there's literally wildlife, and this isn't in a national park, this is just somewhere in Sri Lanka. And so there is traffic and speeding issue there as well. This actually it's a poor photograph. It's the animal that's been hit by a car, literally last Friday on the N1 by Lanesburg. there's actually quite a high number of just leopard fatalities on roads. And we've got an extreme desire for speed in South Africa on our roads. I don't know what it is, but it is definitely one of the contributing factors. Another major driver for carnivores, more specifically, is poverty-driven snaring, for example. And of course, snares and things like gin traps are largely indiscriminate. And so you'll take out a lot of wildlife, not just a target species. And so the area is becoming more and more devoid of these important animals. And there's poverty. People just want to feed their families in most instances. There's conflict. And then, of course, there's a status aspect of hunting as well. So it's all very dismal. And there's conflict in Sri Lanka with elephants, particularly in the south, where there's conflict with crop producers. And so it's, the tale's quite similar between the two countries in that regard. And, this is the signage that you get around the last leopard was on this mountain, this long ago. So we've moved from a trophic system that was quite healthy to the left to a very human-dominated landscape with very little wildlife. Domestic stock has largely replaced ungulates and that sort of thing. So the landscape ecologically looks very different. Some of the solutions to the loss of biodiversity is rescue and rehabilitation. Now that's quite band-aid, but it certainly has an important role to play. And if it's done correctly, often industries can collaborate and fund and contribute in that way as well. And I found that Sri Lanka was highly successful in their rehabilitation efforts. These elephants, for example, is often the mothers being killed, and so they're orphaned. They are still socially elephants. They still understand the boundaries of humans and so on, but they get literally walked back to the national park, which is adjacent to the sanctuary, and another chance of life. There's a lot of human wildlife conflict mitigation to try and protect crops from elephants, for example, and that effort. And it's highly effective. Also, leveraging iconic species to garner attention is an important conservation tool. I mean, the leopard in our context, it's the last free-roaming top carnivore. It's an umbrella species. So by conserving leopard, because they utilize so much space, if you've got a viable leopard population, you've got a very viable ecosystem on its own right that is healthy on its own. I mean, the male leopards in this area use about 12,500 hectares, and so they require space. You can't just have one male leopard in a population. So they really can play a very valuable aspect in habitat conservation. Mitigating human-wildlife conflict, this is really, I've spent a lot of time doing this, and it's the same efforts that take place in Sri Lanka, where it's finding a way to protect your livelihood or livestock from the natural elements and moving away from a paradigm in the South African context of controlling wildlife. So despite our geographic and cultural differences, there's strikingly familiar challenges and opportunities, but the outcomes are quite divergent from one another. I still find that quite interesting. This is the cloud forest in Sri Lanka. It wasn't just a misty day, it is permanently like that. And Houghton Plains is one of the national parks on the right there in that same area. It's cold. It was about 12 degrees Celsius and damp. I mean, it's a striking thing about Sri Lanka was that there were so many places that were so similar to South Africa and landscape-wise. Those forests really reminded me of the garden route in many ways when I was there. There's places that look just like the Lowveld or the undulating hills in the Eastern Cape. And we share so many similar wildlife species. They've got elephants, buffalo, they've got leopard and all the bird life. There were a lot of similarities. We don't have bears. They've got what's called a sloth bear, which I didn't get to see, but that's that footprint in that sandy spot. They were close to it, but I didn't get to see one. And of course, they don't have the fynbos type elements there, which is obviously, as we know, a very unique scenario here. But ultimately, there was a lot of similarities, just environmentally. Socially, they've got extremely high literacy rate of 97%. a very dignified society, very well educated. And while there is poverty, it's not impoverished. Everybody's basically got their garden with some of the best tasting mangoes you'll ever find. The food there is just whole, like it's just like understood. It's just like artisanal, freshly, not mass produced. And everybody's got a banana tree and a mango tree and an avo tree. So everybody's fed really well. They've got such a respect for all animals, and dogs. I mean, if there's a dog that tries to cross the street, the traffic comes to a halt, you know. And it could be a cow in the middle of the highway. It's people don't speed the way they do here. You know, you'll be surprised if anybody is driving 100 kilometers an hour on the road, usually around 80. So that's also a little bit better there. Another striking difference was that there wasn't much plastic pollution. You know, there weren't there wasn't McDonald's everywhere. There wasn't, and even in the big cities, there's really the food is delicious and it's all locally grown, and the drinking water is drinkable throughout that country, which I found another. So you can open the tap and have really delicious water. You can go walk along streams, and it's clean water. It's just a clean country, in many ways. We went to go visit some of the farming areas where there's conflict, not necessarily just with leopard, but they've actually got a lot of conflict with crocodiles. So they've got real challenges. And yet they use non-lethal deterrents like herdsmen, you know, going out and chasing crocodiles away. But they protect their assets in this crawling system. They're still nomadic type of farming where they'll move around with the rainfall and the water. And so they've got quite healthy, vibrant vegetation areas that haven't been overgrazed or over disturbed in certain ways. And they also initiate their own methods. They don't wait for people to come and help them, which I also found kind of a different nuance to South Africa, where we sort of expect help from people. So that was also quite interesting, chatting to the farmers. And this is probably a poor photo. On the left-hand panel, it's actually a doorway. And it's just this deer that had died of natural causes, but they put it up and a bird had made its nest on the head. So instead of breaking the nest down, they just put that barrier so it doesn't make a mess on the doorway. And it's that sort of attitude that is just so different. And you see this everywhere. Each and every animal on earth has as much right to be here as you and me. I mean, this is their culture. So there's a lot of lessons for us to adopt, I think, in South Africa. Sri Lanka is very progressive in culturally ingrained tolerance for wildlife outside of protected areas. We seem to be very tolerant if wildlife is where it should be, not on my area. So we need to we can really learn a lot if we can just think more laterally around these restrictions. And I mean, also their corporates are playing really important roles in conservation. You know, I got to meet some LOLC's CEO, which is like meeting the director of Discovery here. You know, it's they are so conservation driven in their bottom line, in their economic bottom line. They understand the challenges and they're finding ways to be sustainable for their product to be sustainable in the future. They're talking about these things, possibly because in Sri Lanka, you can feel climate change a little bit more easily than you can here. And, you know, maybe they're just more aware because, of where they place. But there's definitely a lot going on in the corporate structures there, where there's a lot more responsibility, in my opinion, than what I've seen here in South Africa. Also, the non-fenced approach for protected areas would be a good one. But that might be a leap, but it would be something to work towards. And I think that finding ways to work with biodiversity and ecosystem processes on production landscapes is certainly a way that South Africa at least is taking baby steps towards, and that's really encouraging. A limitation I found on the Sri Lankan context is that they're not incorporating as much technology into conservation. But that's that I had to sort of search for something for for them to really improve on. So that's a critique that probably isn't even really that useful to them. But certainly for secretive species, they don't collar animals, they don't engage with animals unnecessarily. So there's also that difference between the two countries. So market-related solutions, certainly South Africa has got a long way to go. I feel that, we need to get industries to take more responsibility and accountability to become sustainable and offset the footprints that are being made. And I think that looking right in our backyard is a good place to start. I mean, this is some of the biggest beverage brands and breads and wheat coming from here, and yet there's very little to no conservation effort taking place. And I'm going to put my head on the chopping block for that, but that's just the current status of it. So things certainly in industry is a shortcoming in South Africa. So in conclusion, as different as the countries are, we face very similar challenges. Sri Lanka's ability to coexist and tolerance and attitude is amazing. Their less fortified approach to conservation and more coexistence is interesting. South Africa, a bit more sort of aggressive and utilitarian towards it. We've got a saying, if it pays, it stays. That's sort of the business as usual approach that really can't sit in the world today if we expect conservation and ecosystems to function. And ultimately, it comes to a disconnect between society and nature. I read an article that only 3% of South Africa knows our 5 biodiversity symbols. So I'm going to quiz you guys. We've got a few of them here, so I guess we'll be good at this. Okay, so what's the national bird in South Africa? Okay, the national mammal. Springbok, dankie, Rassie. Okay, the national fish for the anglers. Galjoen, well done. The national tree. Yellowwood. The national plant. So we're up there in the 3%. That has some familiarity and connection more with wildlife, but that was definitely one of the profound things. So we really need to embrace the profound truth that human survival hinges on the ecological survival of nature. And ultimately, the fate of wildlife depends on our willingness to allow them space and to coexist. We can't really question whether we can find solutions. There's plenty of solutions. The question is, will we implement them, and will we implement them in time? I was thinking about starting a Sri Lanka tourism business. It's a must visit for anybody who who here has been to Sri Lanka. Wow. Okay, so it's a unique island, and I would go again for sure. The food is just incredible. You have about 8 different types of curry for breakfast, lunch, and supper. You don't have a sandwich, but I think by day 8 I was craving just a hamburger. But the food is just outstanding. The place, the weather is incredible unless you're up on the spine of the island in that cold cloud forest. The beaches are sensational. It's clean. It's a really dignified world, and it's inexpensive to visit. I'd highly recommend anybody to go and check it out. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thanks, Jeannine. That was fantastic. So I'm going to, with Henny, orchestrate the questions. Henny will do online questions as we've got an audience online, and I'll take questions from the floor, and we'll try and get them across to the audience. One thing I want to just raise, and you hit the critical one, and we've discussed this before, is the role of education. It's just so important. And I've worked a lot in India, been very fortunate. And again, in India, wherever you go, even in the very rural areas, they may be poor, the parents are working out in a rice paddy field, but the kids will be in school. and the school is very structured. The kids wear uniforms, and they really put a great emphasis on education. And perhaps you can comment on that as well. I know you've mentioned it.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to go to quite rural areas, especially in the tea plantations. So there's rural schools there, and even the rural schools are extremely structured, like you say. There's school uniforms. The kids are really well spoken, and it is really eye-opening. Almost the discipline, can I say, but just the respect, potentially is another way to put it. But it's throughout the country, even in the most sort of hidden and cryptic.
That emblem that they use, what bug is that?
Isn't it a lion? What is on the Sri Lankan flag?
No, their conservation icon.
It's I forget the deer's name, but it's a deer. It has antlers. Yeah, it's endemic to them. Yeah. Samal, it's called. Samal. Yeah.
On your left, there's a question.
What does the government in Sri Lanka do to conserve nature, animals?
He wants to know what does the government in Sri Lanka do to conserve animals?
There were over 100. Well, 184, 100 died. There were 88 rescued, what I saw.
Are they
Through the park.
Yeah. So, in
Just
fact,
repeat the question.
so it's a very good question. The question is, what does the Sri Lankan government do to try and manage conservation abuses in a way? And given a very good South African example recently in Kruger, where over 100 vultures were poisoned by poisoning a carcass. So that in Sri Lanka would definitely land you in jail. There's no tolerance of lethal control there. It's not even just part of the law, it's also part of their culture and religion. So there are very high consequences if you get caught, of which there's a good chance, because they do take these types of prosecutions very seriously. So there is a lot more structure and a lot more consequences legally of an exploitative nature to when you're working with conservation and species in general. So that was a noticeable difference.
In front here. Carry on in front. Sorry.
Okay, sorry.
In front and we'll
You
do it.
mentioned, fencing of protected areas, and you also mentioned the sort of general attitude of people towards other species. I mean, obviously those are related. It would be wonderful if we could have less fencing of protected areas in this country, but then is that practical when the animals start to sort of spread out into more populated areas and there isn't really tolerance or understanding? Seems that that's where the focus needs to be before you can take the fences down. You need to change attitudes, and that's really tough. Right?
Yeah, because it's a culture.
Yeah.
And that's
The question again.
so the question is how could one change the conservation model, being from quite a fortified approach, for it to be more connective when attitudes aren't there yet, and so that's the question, and that's the crux of the matter. That is the issue. And that's why I found it so striking, because in many ways I didn't even think about it because it's part of the culture here. But it is certainly possible. And in fact, it's not as far as Sri Lanka, where the conservation model works like this. You go to Zimbabwe or Botswana or Namibia, and it's like this. South Africa is the only place that we fortify our protected areas the way we do. Fences have a role. For example, you could have like a half moon type fence that might stop animals just from coming into a specific area, but they've got alternative routes to meet one another. So it's actually just a South African thing that's not that old. It started off when we set up permanent water points. We put up fences because then we didn't have to be nomadic anymore. And then we would sanitize and exclude everything from our farm. So it's a new phenomenon. In fact, South African traditionally commercial farmers before the outset of windmills were nomadic. They actually put their herds together and moved them together, often with wildlife that was moving around following the water. So it's a strange, and again, it's that question of how did it arise? Why are we so intolerant? is the question. I can't answer that. But certainly it is the aspect for us to focus on. How can we be more open and lateral about how do we coexist? You know, and here's a good example with the baboons being such a conflict. And so how do we coexist? There's no silver bullet. It is an attitudinal thing, and it's a balance, and one has to be willing to try. If you're not willing to try, then we're in the status quo of just everything must be removed from the environment, which isn't an effective school of thought. So it's not easy. You know, if you speak to these guys, they have to sacrifice a lot to work with nature, but it certainly is possible, and it doesn't have to be difficult either. So it's a complex, and that's the nature of this talk. Yeah.
So just to add to that in your answer, it's quite interesting if you go back and look at the history of Kruger Park, particularly the northern section. I don't know if any of you have ever been to the Tulumela ruins. You should do it sometime. But if you look at those ancient people, and we go back hundreds and thousands of years, those people lived with nature. The farmers, the more recent black tribes again, would farm an area, and then they'd move when it was overgrazed. And you know, the northern part of Kruger Park, with Botswana, with Zimbabwe, with Mozambique, there was trading with China and beads way back. You know, there was an amazing history. You've heard of the Mapungubwe, the Zimbabwe ruins. So, you know, our early predecessors, like the ones that lived along the coast here, were far more connected to nature. You know, it's really the settlers who sort of put all the structure in place. Anyway, for another discussion, Malcolm.
Yeah, just to build on what you were just saying now, we stay in Stanford, and we get the blue crane flying over in the evening and early morning, and they fly off into the Overberg
And dozens of
to
them.
graze on the graze on the fields, especially after the drought, etc. But it just shows the difference between land-based animals and animals that can fly. They're only affected by the use of their habitat areas. And we do know that one of the biggest mortalities that you have with the blue crane is the farmers shooting them out because they are competing for land. And yet you've just shown us the Overberg and the wonderful areas which are so populated by farming activity. So do you work at all to try to protect these animals? The question about governmental action against people who do hunt these beautiful national birds about. Is there anything happening in that direction?
So the question is about how some animals can sort of escape persecution, but ultimately they get caught into this agricultural exclusion of being hunted out if they dipping into resources that could otherwise be used by the farming, for example. And yes, there is a lot being done. There's very few prosecutions that have been effective in the court of law, despite having very good law. There is also a lot of property laws and a whole myriad of aspects that come into play with the right to be able to make an income and all of these things needing to be argued with a new version, which is quite novel actually into our legal system, where not just humans have rights, but the animals that exist, they also have rights. It's new to the South African sort of legal doctrine, but it is in place. And there's been, I've been more involved within leopard prosecutions. So there is some movement. It takes a loud voice. It takes, you know, the legal system is a very slow moving one in South Africa. So it takes resources and it takes special skill and interest and just somebody that cares enough to drive it, but you can certainly reach successes. There's NGOs play a really crucial role. in this. So they often drive these different challenges because it can be quite expensive and government doesn't always have the capacity to undertake those, but they certainly do a lot. I think the Western Cape and Cape Nature I work in the Eastern, Western, and Northern Cape, and I can tell you the Cape Nature is phenomenal in having the expertise to at least assist with specialists to take it to prosecution. So it takes a community to get prosecutions done here, but it can be done if anybody's willing enough to drive it.
Yeah, Malcolm, and I think the answer says it all. I mean, South Africa in general has very good laws, you know. It's in the implementation that falls down. I mean, when we talked about it, traffic speeding, you know, people get caught and nothing ever transpires. End of story. At the back there. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, on the prosecution. They recently informed us of the food workshop, and the SAPs arrived and the case is open, but the prosecution is going nowhere. And I think that gets perhaps back to what you talk about culture. Because if we don't have a culture about outrage, like that somebody shot an animal inside some area, within our population, and in our SAPs, I mean, the SAPs, oh, it's a food. Maybe half the community, oh, it's a food. If we've got that kind of culture, then I think that's what you're saying, Ross, it's a whole talk. For that paradigm to shift, our culture needs to shift some.
Gets back to education again.
Yeah.
Lady at the back.
My question also relates back to education. Are there any, in your Cape Nature, different organizations and associations, are there any link back to some hallmarks and witchcraft and so forth to involve them in explaining whatever they do in terms of their cultural dogma or whatever, how it impacts on the environment and what they can do? Because I mean, some hallmarks are huge, and there's now in the paper where they throw their chickens in the ocean because of the cultural.
Yeah.
Not saying whatever in terms of being wrong or whatever.
Yeah.
But I think that could be that's quite huge because on the population, they really still believe in their cultural and their beliefs and so forth for what to do. I wonder if there is a program that you do involve.
So the question relates to, there is obviously quite a historically strong indigenous relationship with and behaviors with natural resources like sangomas, for example. And it's certainly coming into conservation, formal conservation more and more. For example, in the Garden Route National Park, you can harvest medicinal plants to a degree. And that's directly for sangoma type relationships where they can use it as muti and things like that. So this fortified approach is shifting, knowing like, for example, let's say there is this notion of or target to be 30% protected by 2030. That's in 5 years, South Africa's land. So that would have to be a jump in 21% increase in conservation land. So obviously doing that in the traditional context is too expensive. That's where we come into integrating these interfaces within production, within rangelands, within different areas where we need to get different land use zones, integrating conservation into practice. So it's becoming that way. And fortunately, so it is a very new to the sort of westernized culture. It's new, but we're actually just going to a more integrated landscape. But there are formalities, there are a lot of communications with different interest groups. And I think in my recent experience, I was encouraged to see how much communication there are with local communities and formal organizations like Sand Parks, Cape Nature would certainly, there's the stewardship program, which does that. So in fact, governmentally, there's a lot of structures in place to try and integrate and reconnect people.
Kenny, are there any questions from your end?
No, just the Andrew says very fascinating talk and keep spreading the good word. But can you just give me an example, maybe a practical example how you are going to integrate or how you are integrating this into the actual farming land now. I come to Overberg.
Okay.
Good question.
An example of how you would go to the farmer and say, look, you need to add snakes here, or what do you actually tell them?
Okay, so my background is in that specifically. So I work a lot in carnivore conservation, and I've explained why carnivores can be a useful tool. I worked in a land use that was for livestock production. Okay, so there's a lot of conflict, a lot of exclusionary competition. We don't really want animals competing with the livestock, and we don't want animals eating the livestock. So there's a lot of ways to make that a wildlife friendly farm. One, we protect livestock using electric mobile crawling, for example, using lights and deterrents in vulnerable parts of the camp, or when the livestock is pregnant or there's lambs about and there's easy prey about. A lot of the conflict in this context comes from availability and accessibility. So just making sure it's not easily accessible and available to these animals, they will more than not go for other wildlife to eat. And in a lot of these places, it comes with don't kill everything, because a lot of these other things, like the bokkies and porcupines, are important for caracal and leopard and jackal to eat. And so just about rebalancing things. And that's very practical. It's shifting the paradigm from your resource, from the environment to your asset, which in this context is livestock. So in the context of crops and wheat, for example, that's what I'm saying. Industry's really got to play a role. And in fact, it comes back down to consumers that push industry to have a role. I'm not satisfied that my loaf of bread and my beer negatively impacts birds and wildlife and ecosystems. I'm unhappy with that. So I should write to these or form a group and demand that things get taken up to transform things. So there's no silver bullet, there's no one specific action, but encouraging farmers at the scale and intensity with crops might rather be better to go from the top to try and change influences there. But there's not much needed to change, is the irony. You actually just don't use 110% of your land, just use 95% of it, and leave the river courses be river courses. And just don't make it that there's no way for even a butterfly to traverse your property.
It's a very important point. What saddens me, and you only have to go on the route, go through Stanford to Riviersonderend, to see in the agricultural fields there, in the few steep cliffs that are left, there is still original vegetation. But for the rest of it, the farmers have come right down into that little, last gap. And that just, is unforgivable, I think, because those are the little sections that should be left for the riverine rabbits, the coracle, the birds, and it's really not difficult. You just got to educate your tractor drivers better.
So educated will come right here, because I hear people in unwritten manner say, the porcupines have been eating my veggies. Let's get rid of them. I said, how lucky can you be?
Protect your vegetables. You can dig your fence a little bit deeper.
John Blaine?
I remember correctly, in the Eastern Transvaal, there all those pine forests and so on, there was quite a pushback some years or decades ago to protect the watercourses. They weren't allowed to plant within 100 meters of a watercourse.
Yeah.
That doesn't seem to have come into the Overberg wheat belt.
It's probably because it's a very ancient wheat belt. I mean, this is very close to Cape Town, where the original settlers arrived, and we were utilizing this land for much longer than there. So that's why you see it like the Swartland and the Overberg are it's basically two open cast mines at the level of.
But it's not too late.
No, absolutely, and it actually. Exactly. It doesn't take much at all to transfer it back, and that's the good news. But that's a different talk I'd like to do. Is rest.
Difficult calculation to determine how much land the farmer will lose.
Yeah, exactly. And what is that economic balance? Yeah.
Okay, another question here, and then we'll work with you.
We talk about education, but I think consumers actually have a role to play, because if you want to pressurize corporations, you have to push them on their bottom line. So if you don't say these products that you're producing are
Destructive.
are a problem, if you don't actually address them on the level of the product and try and get people to boycott products, say, we don't like this product that you're producing because these are the knock-on effects of its cultivation. These are the things, the factors that are happening. Educate people also on that level, not just education in the sort of broader sense in an environment like this. Actually educating consumers to say you can't change corporations unless you push them where it hurts.
Absolutely.
Okay, will you join us afterwards? We want you in our OGG group. So we need your details. Fine.
I just thought the ISO 14,000 is a ecological nature conservation type of conservation type of standard. I wonder if there also could be applied to actual farmers.
Yeah, I think, it's in direct interest to the farmers, because farmers want to be sustainable. They've got to keep up with the market and the industry standards that are so competitive. So, and that's why going to industry in some cases is the only way, because farmers can't do it all by themselves. We do need to facilitate, and it comes together in that regard. So yeah, that is important.
I think it speaks to the gentleman in front, so
Yeah.
if you are in a proper compliance to that particular international standard, it means you are doing your farming, proper farming and the best environment and so forth. And then it means you can market your product even more better, because it's like it's going to go back.
That's right. And also, yeah, as a consumer, you get a value-added product. And so you'd want to you can pay a premium and get that farmer supported rather than the farmer that's not, so it's exactly would support that. So there are lots of things in place, like honey badger friendly honey, dolphin friendly tuna. This isn't a new concept. It's very easy to apply, but that came from people caring enough to change the legislation. It's a very crucial role. Yeah.
So we need to discover that and do that.
Yeah.
And overstrains or something.
Great.
And just to balance the argument and give some credit, we just had a wonderful field trip excursion through the Robertson Montague area over Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And in the Breda Rafid Conservancy, there's a big new conservancy group there amongst the farmers. And they have actually employed and he's a lovely young guy, a gentleman named Jacques Smith, to be their sort of manager and start introducing, I think, some of the things we're talking about. And around Worcester too, there's a wonderful lady, Ansa LaRue, who's a plant ecologist, and she too is working with the farmers to get them to understand the importance of geology, where it all starts, soils, water, and the relationship, with the plants. So I think, and you mentioned again the Western Cape, I think we're starting to see that, but we need to give it, more push. And one of the reasons, the OGG has had this meeting today too, is I think we've also got to get away from silos. In the past, we had all these wonderful departments, but they didn't cross-pollinate. And I think that in the new world that we live in today, and with the population growth, that's what we all need to consider as well. And I come back to the old real challenge of education in this country. But thanks, Jeannine, that was wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, and we will have you.